Sam Melville. In 1969, a former engineer walked into 8 of the most heavily secured buildings in New York City and left explosives behind in every single one of them. He hit the Federal Office Building. He hit Chase Manhattan. He hit the Marine Midland Tower, where the blast injured 19 people. 2 years later, he was dead on the floor of Attica, and the state trooper who took credit for the shot said Melville was about to throw a Molotov cocktail. No Molotov cocktail was ever found. Witnesses said he had already surrendered. Samuel Joseph Melville was born in 1934 in New York City under the surname Grossman. He had trained as an engineer and drifted into radical politics by the late 60s. Vietnam radicalized him. By 1969, he had decided words were no longer enough. Between July and November of that year, Melville and a small circle of accomplices planted explosive devices at 8 targets across Manhattan: the Federal Office Building on Federal Plaza, the Marine Midland Building, Standard Oil offices inside the RCA Building, Chase Manhattan Headquarters, the General Motors Building, the Criminal Courts Building, the Whitehall Street Army Induction Center, and the pier operated by the United Fruit Company. The Marine Midland blast injured 19 people, but Melville had designed every device to detonate after hours. He wanted a message, not a body count, and no one died. He was arrested on November 12, 1969, alongside a man named George Demeril, who turned out to be a federal informant. The two were planting charges on National Guard trucks when agents moved in. Even in custody, Melville tried to escape. In March of 1970, he overpowered an unarmed federal marshal in a Manhattan courthouse and made a break for it. He was tackled before he reached the door. He pleaded guilty in May to conspiracy, to one of the bombings, and to the assault on the marshal. He was sentenced to 13 to 18 years and shipped to Attica. That is where he became something more dangerous than a bomber. He became an organizer. Inside Attica, Melville founded an underground prison newspaper called Iced Pig. He wrote a widely circulated essay on prison labor titled Anatomy of the Laundry. He was placed in a housing unit the guards called 5 Company, a group reserved for men the state considered troublemakers, and he was the only white inmate in the group. By the summer of 1971, he was widely regarded as one of the principal spokesmen of what was about to come. On September 9, 1971, 1,281 men rioted and seized control of the prison. They took 42 staff hostage. They elected spokesmen, issued demands, and for 4 days, D-Yard belonged to the inmates. Grievances included 1 shower a week, 1 roll of toilet paper a month, chronic overcrowding, censored mail, and an all-white guard force with a documented history of racial abuse against a largely black and Hispanic population. On September 13th, on the direct order of Governor Nelson Rockefeller, state police and corrections officers stormed the yard behind tear gas dropped from helicopters and opened fire into the smoke. In roughly 6 minutes, they fired between 2,000 and 3,000 rounds. 43 people died, 33 inmates and 10 staff. Every hostage killed that morning was killed by law enforcement gunfire, a fact the state initially denied, and that a Monroe County pathologist named John Edlund proved through autopsy over the objections of his own government. Sam Melville was among the dead. And here is where his story stops being simple. Multiple witnesses inside D-Yard reported seeing him alive well after the initial assault. In later civil litigation, and in a book by his son Joshua Melville, a state trooper named Vincent Tobiah was identified as having taken credit for firing the shot that killed him. Tobiah's account was that Melville was preparing to throw a Molotov cocktail. No cocktail was ever recovered near the body. Forensics indicated he was shot at close range. Multiple inmate accounts placed him with his hands visible when the round hit. The dispute has never been resolved. His letters, smuggled out of Attica and published posthumously under the title Letters from Attica, with a foreword by the attorney William Kunstler, became one of the defining prison documents of the era. The state of New York eventually settled with the surviving inmates and the families of the dead. In February of 2000, federal judge Michael Teleska approved a $12 million settlement, divided among more than 500 former inmates and relatives, in a lawsuit that had originally sought $2.8 billion. Not one law enforcement officer was ever criminally prosecuted for any death that day. Which brings us to the one man who was. John Boncore. He was 19 years old when he arrived at Attica, and he was there for less than a month before the yard exploded. When it was over, he was the only person in America convicted of murder for anything that happened in those 4 days. He always said he never touched the man he was accused of killing. Governor Hugh Carey eventually agreed. John Pasquale Boncore was born in January of 1952 in Buffalo, New York. His father was of Mohawk and Cree descent. His mother was Italian-American. When John was 5, his father died in an industrial accident, and the family fell into poverty. He was placed in a series of foster homes he later described as abusive. By his teens, he was homeless. He was arrested for robbing a sub shop and sent to the Elmira Reformatory. In August of 1971, aged 19, he was transferred to Attica to serve out the final months of his sentence. The riot started 3 weeks later. During the 4-day standoff, a corrections officer named William Quinn was severely beaten by inmates on the morning of September 9th. He died of his injuries 2 days later. His death changed everything. It made amnesty for the inmates legally impossible, and it hardened Governor Rockefeller against any negotiated end to the standoff. When the state stormed the yard on September 13th, Quinn was one of the 10 staff members who did not survive the retaking. But he was the only staff member whose death was attributed to the inmates rather than to state gunfire. Prosecutors needed someone to answer for him. They chose John Boncore. His trial began in 1974. His defense was led by the same attorney whose client list already included the Melville family, William Kunstler. Boncore consistently denied taking part in the beating. He said he had been elsewhere in the prison when Quinn was attacked. The prosecution disagreed. In 1975, he was convicted of murder under the name John B. Hill and sentenced to 20 years. He was the only conviction. Out of 43 deaths, out of an assault that fired nearly 3,000 rounds into a crowded yard, out of every prisoner beaten and every officer killed, one 19-year-old defendant carried the entire legal weight of Attica by himself. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. The verdict became a national controversy almost immediately. Legal observers, civil rights groups, and members of the McKay Commission, the state's own official inquiry, questioned whether a fair trial was even possible under the circumstances. The Commission's own final report described what had happened at Attica as the bloodiest single-day encounter between Americans since the Civil War, aside from the Indian massacres of the late 1800s. In 1976, 1 year after sentencing, New York Governor Hugh Carey granted John Boncore clemency. He was released, and he never went back to prison. He also never went back to the name John Hill. He took the name Dakajawaya, which means splitting the sky, and he joined the American Indian movement. He became the Sundance leader during the 1995 armed standoff at Gustafson Lake in British Columbia. He acted in television, appearing in shows like Men in Trees and in the film The Last Rites of Ransom Pride. In 2009, he was arrested in Calgary, attempting to carry out a citizen's arrest of former United States President George W. Bush, whom he had publicly accused of war crimes. In March of 2013, he was found dead near his home on the Adams Lake Indian Reserve outside Chase, British Columbia. He was 61 years old. The British Columbia Coroner's Service ruled the death accidental, attributing it to a combination of alcohol and cocaine and citing an enlarged heart. His blood alcohol level was recorded above 0.35. Some of his supporters questioned the ruling. No criminal investigation was ever opened. To this day, the only person the state of New York was ever able to convict for the events of September 13, 1971, spent 1 year in prison for it before the governor of New York decided the case could not stand. The next man on this list wasn't in the yard when it erupted. He was already gone. Joseph Sullivan. In April of 1971, 6 months before the riot that would make Attica infamous, a mob hitman from Queens hid himself under a pile of empty flour bags in the back of a delivery truck and rode out the front gate. He is, to this day, the only inmate in the recorded history of Attica Correctional Facility to escape it. Joseph Sullivan was born in March of 1939 in Queens, New York. His father was an NYPD detective. Sullivan grew up around the same police force his son would spend the rest of his adult life running from. He attended Catholic school. He would later tell a reporter from a jail cell in 1981 that he was just a nice Irish kid who had gone to the same schools as everyone else. What he did not mention was that by then he was suspected in as many as 20 to 30 killings. His criminal career began in 1965 with a bar fight. He killed a father of 8 children at the Willow Bar and Grill in Queens, an argument that ended with a manslaughter charge. He was sentenced and shipped to Attica. That is where the nickname started. Sullivan reportedly suffered from an undiagnosed salivary gland disorder that caused him to foam at the mouth when he spoke, and the guards began calling him Mad Dog. He kept the name for the rest of his life. He also kept planning. On April 7, 1971, Sullivan disappeared from the prison. By one account, he scaled a wall using a homemade grappling hook fashioned from lengths of pipe he had smuggled together over months. By another account, and the one most law enforcement sources have accepted, he hid inside a bakery delivery truck, buried under empty flour bags, and rode past the guards without a second look. Either way, he was gone. The manhunt was massive. State police, federal marshals, and the NYPD chased leads for nearly 6 weeks. He was recaptured in Greenwich Village, sitting in a bar, carrying a sawed-off weapon. He never gave up the details of the escape. To this day, there is no definitive public account of how the only man to ever break out of Attica did it. He was paroled in 1975, and that is where Mad Dog Sullivan became the version of himself that federal prosecutors would eventually build entire investigations around. Between his parole and his final arrest, he worked as a contract killer for New York organized crime. Prosecutors could never prove most of it. But in December of 1981, outside a restaurant in the Rochester area, he walked up to a Teamsters vice president named John Fiorino and killed him with a shotgun. He was also convicted of 2 additional murders on Long Island. In 1982, he was sentenced to 75 years to life. After the Fiorino killing, one of the lead law enforcement officers hunting him warned his pursuers to be careful because the man they were chasing was armed and dangerous and, in his words, a mad dog killer. The tabloids ran with it. The nickname that had started with a medical condition in a prison yard was now printed on every front page in New York State. He spent the rest of his life in the New York correction system. In June of 2017, at Fishkill Correctional Facility, Joseph Sullivan died of cancer in hospice care. He was 78 years old, and no one has escaped Attica since. The name that comes next is one of the most controversial ever attached to the prison, in part because the paper trail linking him to Attica is thin, and in part because when he was finally caught, he had already killed a state trooper to make it happen. Ralph Phillips. On April 2, 2006, a career criminal serving time at the Erie County Correctional Facility in Alden, New York, used an industrial can opener to cut a hole through the ceiling of the prison kitchen and walked out. And no, I'm not making that up. For the next 5 months, he became the target of one of the largest manhunts in the state's history. Before it ended, he had shot 3 New York State troopers, and one of them was dead. Ralph James Phillips was born in June of 1962 and raised in the small town of Stockton, New York. By the time he broke out of Alden, he had spent 20 of the previous 23 years incarcerated. He was 43 years old, and he had made a lifetime out of being in and out of custody. The escape itself was almost absurd. He climbed onto a kitchen prep counter, cut through the ceiling tiles with an industrial can opener meant for restaurant-sized food containers, worked his way into the crawl space above the kitchen, and disappeared. By the time the guards noticed he was missing, he was miles away. What followed was 5 months of ambushes, sightings, roadblocks, and near misses across the western half of New York State. Phillips knew the woods. He had grown up in them. He moved through Chautauqua and Cattaraugus counties like a ghost. Locals began wearing shirts that read, "Where's Bucky?" A regional restaurant added a Bucky burger to the menu. The manhunt became folk theater. Then it turned deadly. On June 10, 2006, Phillips ambushed State Trooper Sean Brown during a traffic stop near Elmira and shot him. Brown survived. On August 31st, in the town of Pomfret, Phillips positioned himself in the darkness outside a home he suspected was under police surveillance and opened fire on 2 more troopers, Donald Baker Jr. and Joseph Longobardo, with a stolen high-powered rifle. Baker survived his injuries. Longobardo did not. He died on September 3, 2006. On September 7th, the FBI added Ralph Phillips to its 10 most wanted fugitives list. He was the 483rd name ever placed there. He was captured the next day, September 8th, in Warren County, Pennsylvania. He pleaded guilty. Asked how he wanted to plead, his answer was that he was guilty as hell. In December of 2006, Judge Richard Clark sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole for the murder of Trooper Longobardo. He received an additional 40 years to life for the wounding of Trooper Baker, another 40 to life for shooting Trooper Brown, and 25 to life for the original escape. Judge Clark told him from the bench that he had known exactly what he was doing. Which brings us to the part of the story where the sourcing needs to be honest. Attica has been named as one of the facilities that held Phillips at some point during his incarceration. That claim traces primarily to a 2015 listicle in the Buffalo News and appears in secondary summaries repeating that article. What has never been confirmed in the public record is when Phillips was there, for how long, or under what conditions. The Attica connection may well be real, but the paper trail is thin, and it is worth being clear about that on the way in. What is not thin is the rest of it. Ralph Phillips is one of the very few Americans currently serving natural life without parole for the murder of a police officer in an ambush attack, and he is still alive as of this recording, held somewhere inside the New York State prison system. The next man on this list never fired a shot. He did not run a bar. He did not hold up a truck. He wore a lab coat and told people he was a doctor. Dean Fiello. He treated an elite Manhattan clientele. He rented a boutique medical office. He had a professional website, a client list that reportedly included fashion designers and finance executives, and he charged premium rates for laser and dermatology procedures. What he did not have was a medical license, a medical degree, or any legitimate medical training whatsoever. And in April of 2003, one of his patients died on his table, and instead of calling for help, he buried her under a concrete slab in his garage. Dean Fiello was born in August of 1959 in Madison, New Jersey. By the late 1990s, he had built a small skin and laser practice in New York City called Skin Ovations. His clients believed he was a licensed dermatologist. The state of New York eventually figured out he was not. In October of 2002, he was arrested and charged with 3 counts of practicing medicine without a license. He kept treating patients anyway. Maria Cruz was 35 years old. She was a Filipina-American investment banker with an MBA from Fordham University. She had gone to Fiello for what she believed was a routine cosmetic procedure. On April 13, 2003, during that procedure, Fiello injected her with a lethal quantity of lidocaine. She went into cardiac arrest and died on the table. He did not call an ambulance. He did not call the police. And somehow, it gets worse. According to his own later admission in a 2022 ABC television interview, he placed her body inside a stolen suitcase, drove it across state lines to his home in Newark, New Jersey, and buried her in the garage. Then he poured a concrete slab over the burial site to seal it in. 5 months later, in September of 2003, he fled the country. He went to Costa Rica. He assumed he had left the problem behind him. He had not. In February of 2004, his former partner Greg Bach contacted authorities and told them where Maria Cruz's body was. Investigators pulled up the concrete slab in the garage of the Newark home on February 18th. They found her exactly where Fiello had left her. He was arrested in Costa Rica and returned to the United States. On December 4th, 2006, in New York State Supreme Court, he pleaded guilty to first-degree assault and to unauthorized practice of medicine. He was sentenced to 20 years, and he was sent to Attica. That is where he spent the next 17 to 18 years of his life. By his own account, Fiello got sober in prison. He converted to Quakerism. He worked in the prison programs. In January of 2022, he was paroled. Upon his release, he took a job as a maintenance man at a grocery store. In a December 2022 interview with ABC's news program 2020, he was asked about Maria Cruz. He told the reporter that not a day passed when he did not think about her, or about her family, or about the fact that he had acted like a coward. Asked specifically about burying her under his garage floor, he said the idea to make her part of the slab had simply come to him, and that he could not believe he had done it, but that he had. Maria Cruz's family did not accept the apology. Her mother, in a public statement made after the plea, described her daughter's death as something she would never learn to live with, particularly because Maria had come to the United States looking for the same opportunity every immigrant looks for, and she had trusted the man who killed her because she believed he was a doctor. Dean Fiello died in January of 2024. He was 64 years old. He had been out of Attica for exactly 2 years. If you're liking this so far and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. Subscribe so you don't miss other cases. Nauman Hussein. On October 6, 2018, a modified stretch limousine carrying 17 passengers on their way to a 30th birthday party lost control on a downhill grade in the small town of Schoharie, New York. It blew through a T intersection, struck a parked SUV in the parking lot of a country store and killed everyone on board. It also killed the driver. It also killed 2 pedestrians standing next to the SUV. 20 people died in a single moment. The limousine had failed multiple safety inspections. The driver did not have the license required to operate it, and the man who owned the company that rented it out is currently serving time at Attica. Nauman Hussein was the operator of Prestige Limousine, a small livery company based in the Albany area of upstate New York. His father, Shahed Hussein, was the registered owner. Nauman handled the day-to-day operations. Their fleet included a 2001 Ford Excursion that had been modified into a stretch limousine, a modification the company had never legally certified for its passenger count. The vehicle was registered to seat 10 people. On the day of the crash, it was carrying 18. Its brakes had been failing multiple state inspections for months. The driver, a 53-year-old man named Scott Lisanikia, did not hold the commercial passenger endorsement required to operate a vehicle of that size and configuration. The passengers were a group of friends and family celebrating the 30th birthday of Amy Steenberg. The group included 4 of the King sisters and their spouses and closest friends. They had rented the limousine specifically because they wanted no one in the group to drive that day. At around 1:50 in the afternoon, the driver lost control at the bottom of a long downhill grade at the intersection of routes 30 and 30A. The limousine failed to stop, crossed the intersection at high speed, and slammed into a parked SUV in the parking lot of the Apple Barrel Country Store. 2 pedestrians standing near the SUV, 46-year-old Brian Hof and 70-year-old James Schnurr, were killed on impact. The driver was killed. All 17 passengers were killed. The victims ranged in age from 24 to 70. All 20 were adults. Their names, later released by the New York State Police, included Axel and Amy Steenberg, both 29, Richard Steenberg, 34, Allison King, 31, Mary and Robert Dyson, 33 and 34, Abigail and Adam Jackson, both 34, and 14 others. It was the deadliest transportation accident in the United States since the February 2009 Colgan air crash outside Buffalo, which had killed 50 people. Legally, the case was a slow-motion collision. In September of 2021, Nauman Hussein accepted a plea deal that would have resolved the entire case without any state prison time whatsoever. He pleaded guilty to 20 counts of criminally negligent homicide. When the case came before Judge Peter Lynch for sentencing, however, Judge Lynch rejected the plea outright, calling it fundamentally flawed. The plea was withdrawn. The case went to trial. On May 17, 2023, a jury convicted Hussein on all 20 counts. On May 31st, he was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in state prison. He appealed. In November of 2024, an appellate court unanimously denied his appeal. Presiding Justice Elizabeth Gary, writing for the court, found that Hussein had been aware of the state of disrepair of the limousine's braking system and had consciously disregarded it. The court described the sentence as a reflection of the grievous harm caused by his recklessness and his callousness. Nauman Hussein is currently incarcerated at Attica Correctional Facility. In 2025, his father publicly disclosed that Nauman had been diagnosed with cancer while in custody. 20 families still live with the consequences of a decision he made in a garage. The next name on this list is one of the reasons content warnings exist. Aron Key. Between 1991 and 1998, 3 young women were killed in East Harlem. 2 of them were teenagers. One of them was 13 years old. For years, no one connected the cases. The man responsible walked the same streets he had grown up on, watched the same news reports the rest of the neighborhood watched, and lived what looked like an ordinary life. He was identified only after a detective handed him a paper cup of water during an unrelated arrest, quietly bagged the cup as evidence, and sent it to the New York State DNA lab. Because this case involves minor victims, this segment describes what the court and the investigation established, rather than the details of what was done. That is a deliberate editorial choice. Aaron Malik Key was born in September of 1973 in Manhattan. He also went by Aaron Warford and by the nickname Ace. Between the ages of 17 and 24, he became one of the most prolific violent offenders East Harlem had seen in a generation. His first known killing took place on January 24, 1991. Paula Ilera was 13 years old. She was walking home when Key, then 17, intercepted her. She was harmed fatally that day. The case went unsolved for years. In 1997, 19-year-old Johalis Castro was killed. Investigators later determined she had also been targeted by Key. In 1998, Rashida Washington was killed under similar circumstances. Her age is listed in different sources as either 17 or 18. Key was tied to her death by physical evidence. Between these killings, and for years before and after, Key was also responsible for a pattern of predatory offenses against other young women in the neighborhood. Court filings established that victims included girls as young as 13 and 15. What the investigation eventually uncovered was staggering in its scope. For most of the 1990s, none of it was linked. Key had no DNA on file. He was interviewed as a possible witness in the Ilera case in 1991 and was ruled out at the time. The break came in early 1999. Key was arrested for an unrelated theft. During his booking, a detective offered him a cup of water. Key drank it, set it down, and left. The detective bagged the cup as evidence. The saliva on the rim of the cup was sent to the New York State DNA database, where it matched physical evidence recovered from all 3 homicide cases and from multiple assault cases going back nearly a decade. Key ran. He fled to Miami with a 15-year-old girl named Angelique Stallings, who was later recovered unharmed. He was arrested in Florida on February 19, 1999, and returned to New York to stand trial. His trial began in late 2000. On December 16, 2000, a Manhattan jury convicted him on 22 counts, including 3 counts of murder, multiple counts of predatory assault, and robbery. In January of 2001, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 400 additional years. In August of 2004, he pleaded guilty to another assault charge that had been filed against him separately, adding another 20 years to a sentence that was already mathematically endless. The presiding judge at his sentencing, Justice Joan Sudolnik, said from the bench that she did not know what to say to a person who appeared to have no soul, no conscience, no morality, and no heart. Paula Ilera's mother, Olga Ilera, told the courtroom she would never learn to live without her daughter, and that she had brought her to the United States in search of the American dream. One of the detectives who had worked the case for years, Mike Ulacco, said afterward that Key had needed only to be put away. When the verdict was read, Key shouted profanity at the gallery. He is incarcerated at Attica Correctional Facility, where he is expected to die. The next name on this list also killed someone he was supposed to love. Michael Kenny. On March 10, 2011, a woman gave her estranged husband a haircut and a shave in the second-floor bathroom of the Manhattan hair salon where she worked. Minutes later, he took her life. Then he stole roughly $800 from the register and ran. 8 years later, inside Attica, he tried to do it again to another man. The prosecutors gave up trying to make it matter. Whatever they charged him with was going to run at the same time as what he was already serving. Michael Kenny was born around 1968 or 1969. By the time he committed the murder that would define his name in New York tabloids, he already had a criminal record that included robbery convictions and multiple violations of orders of protection filed against him by his estranged wife, Denise Kenny. Denise Kenny was 40 years old. She was a Trinidadian-born hairstylist. She worked at DeColinas Hair Salon on West 35th Street in Midtown Manhattan. She had been trying to separate herself from Michael for months, but the couple had never fully broken contact. On the morning of March 10, 2011, Michael walked into the salon and asked her for a haircut and a shave. She agreed. She took him upstairs to the second-floor bathroom, which was quieter than the main salon floor. That is where he killed her. The attack was so violent, the knife used broke into 3 separate pieces. After the killing, he emptied the salon register of roughly $800 and fled the city. He drove south. He was arrested the following day in Maryland, after leading state police there on a 5-mile pursuit. Kenny was extradited back to New York and charged with second-degree murder and aggravated criminal contempt. His trial concluded in 2013. He was convicted on all counts. On March 28, 2013, he was sentenced to 25 years to life. The New York media coverage was extensive. Multiple outlets referred to him by a nickname that stuck for years, calling him the crazy-eyed ex-con. Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr., in a public statement made after the sentencing, said domestic violence rarely stays contained to the home, and that it often follows a victim into the workplace, and that this case was a textbook example of that pattern. Kenny was sent to Attica. He was not done there. In September of 2019, Kenny was involved in an altercation with another inmate inside Attica. During the altercation, he attempted to stab the other man to death. The victim survived. Prosecutors charged Kenny with attempted murder. In December of 2019, he pleaded guilty. In sentencing, Wyoming County Judge Michael Mohun handed him another 15 years to life. The problem was that Mohun's sentence was ordered to run concurrent with the 25 to life Kenny was already serving. In practical terms, this meant that Kenny received no additional prison time whatsoever for trying to kill a second person. The New York Daily News, in its coverage, noted plainly that the new sentence was meaningless because it was concurrent. That's not a typo, by the way. A man convicted of murdering his wife, then convicted of trying to murder another human being while already incarcerated for the first crime, will not serve 1 extra day for the second attempt. He was later transferred out of Attica to Coxsackie Correctional Facility. He remains alive and incarcerated as of this recording. The next name on this list was inside Attica 2 years after the uprising itself, and his conviction decades later remains one of the most contested legal outcomes in American civil rights history. H. Rap Brown. In October of 1971, 1 month after the state of New York stormed the Attica prison yard and killed 43 people, a man who had spent most of the previous year on the FBI's most wanted list resurfaced on a rooftop in Manhattan in the middle of a shootout with police. He had been the national chairman of one of the most influential black activist organizations in American history. 2 years later, he would be an Attica inmate. 3 decades after that, he would be convicted of a Georgia murder that his supporters still say he did not commit. Hubert Gerald Brown was born in October of 1943 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. In 1967, at the age of 23, he became the 5th chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, succeeding Stokely Carmichael. He was rapidly identified by the federal government as one of the most dangerous public speakers in America. His statements from that period included the observation that violence was as American as cherry pie, and the promise that if the country did not come around, it would burn down. He briefly held the title of Minister of Justice for the Black Panther Party, and in 1970, during a Maryland trial on inciting to riot charges, he vanished. The FBI added him to its most wanted list. He resurfaced on October 16, 1971. That night, an armed robbery went wrong at a bar called the Red Carpet Lounge on Manhattan's Upper West Side. The two men who tried to hold up the bar were chased onto the rooftop by responding officers. One of them was Hubert Brown. He was shot twice during the confrontation. He survived. He was convicted of armed robbery in 1973 and sentenced to 5 to 15 years. He served approximately 5 of those years at Attica Correctional Facility, arriving 2 years after the uprising. Before sentencing, he told the court that truth crushed into the earth would rise again. Inside Attica, he converted to Sunni Islam. He affiliated with the Dar-ul-Islam movement. He took the name Jamil Abdullah al-Amin. He was released in 1976. He then rebuilt his life in Atlanta, Georgia, where he ran a small grocery store and became a locally respected imam for the following 2 decades. That life ended in March of 2000. On March 16, 2000, Fulton County Sheriff's deputies Ricky Kinchin and Algernon English attempted to serve a warrant on Al-Amin near his store in the West End neighborhood of Atlanta. They were fired on. Deputy Kinchin was killed the following day. Deputy English survived. Al-Amin was later arrested. He was tried and, on March 9, 2002, convicted on 13 counts, including murder. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The conviction has never stopped being controversial. Supporters of Al-Amin, including the Council on American Islamic Relations, pointed to several issues with the case. Another man in federal custody, Otis Jackson, repeatedly confessed under oath to being the shooter that night. Deputy English, at trial, described the man who shot him as having gray eyes. Al-Amin's eyes were brown. Trial testimony indicated that the shooter had been hit by return fire. When Al-Amin was arrested, doctors found no bullet wounds on him. The prosecution stood by the conviction. Deputy English testified without hesitation that Al-Amin was the man who had shot both him and his partner with an assault rifle that night, and that he was the only shooter he saw at the scene. Al-Amin spent the rest of his life inside the federal prison system, moved between Georgia State Prison, ADX Florence in Colorado, USP Tucson, and finally the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. On November 23, 2025, he died there of cancer at the age of 82, which brings us to the last name on the list, and the only one who was killed in the middle of eating clams. Joseph Gallo. He was a Brooklyn mobster, and he died on his birthday in the middle of a meal at a restaurant he had been to 100 times. He had spent nearly a decade in New York State prisons, including a stretch inside Attica. He had used his time inside to read philosophy, paint watercolors, and predict a shift in the American underworld that would eventually put him on a collision course with the family that had raised him. In the end, the collision came at a table in Little Italy on his 43rd birthday. Joseph Gallo was born on April 7, 1929, in Red Hook, Brooklyn. He grew up around organized crime. By the 1950s, he was a soldier and later a capo regime in the Profaci crime family, which would later reorganize as the Colombo family. His nickname was Crazy Joe. He ran floating dice games, high-stakes card games, extortion operations, and loan sharking. His crew was allegedly involved in the 1957 contract killing of Albert Anastasia, one of the most infamous mob hits in American history. In 1961, Gallo made the decision that would change his life. He instigated what became known as the First Colombo War by kidnapping 4 of Joseph Profaci's top men and holding them for a change in the family's leadership. It did not go the way he had hoped. Later that year, on charges rooted in a case involving a Brooklyn businessman and bar owner he had shaken down, he was convicted of conspiracy and extortion. On December 21, 1961, he was sentenced to 7 to 14 years. He would serve approximately 10 of them. His prison time was split between 3 New York State facilities: Green Haven, Attica, Auburn. He was at Attica for a significant portion of that stretch, though not during the uprising itself. He had already been released a few months before it happened. What he did while he was inside became part of his legend. Gallo self-educated aggressively. He read history, literature, and philosophy. He learned watercolor painting. He befriended black inmates, including the future Harlem drug trafficker Nicky Barnes, and he told anyone who would listen that the future of American organized crime was going to be black, not Italian, and that the mafia was going to lose the streets within a generation. Some accounts credit him with helping to keep the peace during smaller disturbances at Attica during his years there. He was released in 1971. He came home to a family that no longer knew what to do with him. In June of that same year, Colombo family boss Joe Colombo was shot at an Italian-American civil rights rally in Manhattan. The gunman was killed at the scene. The shooting was widely blamed on a Gallo associate, and the Colombo family began looking for payback. They found it on Gallo's 43rd birthday. On April 7, 1972, exactly 1 year after his release from prison, Gallo went out to dinner at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. He was with his wife, his stepdaughter, his sister, and 1 bodyguard. Sometime after midnight, gunmen entered the restaurant and opened fire on the table. Gallo was hit multiple times. He staggered out onto Mulberry Street and collapsed. He was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly afterward. The hit was never officially solved. Decades later, the mob enforcer Frank Sheeran claimed in interviews and in the book that would become the film The Irishman that he had personally killed Gallo that night. No corroborating evidence has ever emerged to support the claim. Law enforcement has never publicly named a killer. The judge who had sentenced Gallo in 1961 described him from the bench as a man with an utter contempt for the law and a menace to society. Whether or not that was true when he first went inside, by the time he came out, he had been reading philosophy for a decade and forming alliances that the mob considered a betrayal. He was killed on the 7th birthday he had celebrated as a free man. 10 men, 1 prison, decades of consequence. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.